Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining our webinar today. This conversation will not be a slide deck, although you see one in the background. This will be a candid conversation with Josh Imhoff, the tech lead on our SRE team, and Amrutha Ranade, the tech writer for CockroachCloud. So I will turn it over to them. I just have to figure out how to... Oh, if you have any questions, please use the QA panel. This way, if we can't get to your question on this in this next hour, we can get back to you and ensure that your questions get answered. So without further ado, let's see if I can turn off the presentation and get it over to Josh and Amrutha.
Hello, thanks for introducing us, Jessica. Hi, Josh.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. So you have written the blog post about using Kubernetes for automation for CockroachCloud, and I wanted to use this hour to dig deeper into it.
Sounds great.
But before we get to it, you want to share the origin story of CockroachCloud?
Sure. Yeah, so CockroachDB is this distributed SQL database. And today, most of our customers, they run CockroachDB on their own. So they might run it on public clouds, or they might run it on data centers, their own data centers, but they kind of like take on all of that operational complexity. So the idea of CockroachCloud is that instead of doing it that way, the SRE team and the team at Cockroach Labs will run the database for the customer. Currently, we will run on GCP or AWS, and we'll take on like all the operational complexity of running like this complicated distributed SQL database. So,
I need you guys to pause for a second. We're getting a lot of chatter that the audio is bad.
Okay.
Oh.
It sounds like, okay.
Yeah, go ahead and address it.
It sounds like our audio is kind of bad, so we're going to try to fix that.
Can you make sure that it's coming from that mic?
What do you mean?
It's great for Todd.
Todd says it's good for him. Good for him.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Okay, it sounds like it's okay.
We are back on track. That's awesome.
Yeah, so, okay, so we've been in like a public alpha for the last year or so. So we have customers running on CockroachCloud right now, production customers. And the way that the alpha worked is a user would come in and they'd kind of like talk to the salespeople or a product manager, and they'd say, I want this Cockroach cluster running in GCP or AWS and in this cloud region or that cloud region, these many nodes. And then in a business day or so, the SRE team would spin up a cluster for the customer. And we do this via automation, but it was a little bit manual. It took some time. That's why we did the business day thing. And so that's worked well. But that's not what we want to do now. So now we're in a public beta, and the idea of the beta is like self-service. So instead of that model, a user comes into this UI that's kind of like the GCP console UI, and they just can request a cluster right there. They can say, I want a cluster running in US East with 4 nodes and on GCP. And then the automation that we've built will create that cluster in like 15 minutes or so and give it to the user. And then like the user can use it right there.
So the automation technology that we chose for CockroachCloud is Kubernetes.
Right.
But that's not what we started with. So do you want to walk us through the journey of ending up with Kubernetes? Yeah,
totally. When I got here like maybe in January of this year. So like 9 months, 10 months ago or so. And there were kind of 2 camps. There were some people that wanted us to use Kubernetes, and there was others that did it. And there were a lot of people that really were in both camps, but we were very unsure. So like I started as an SRE at Google. That was my first job out of college. I did that like 4 years ago or so. And at Google, we don't use, like Kubernetes is not really used, despite that Google builds Kubernetes. They use this similar thing that's a predecessor to Kubernetes called Borg. And I was just so used to running distributed systems on top of Borg that to me, I was kind of like, I almost didn't realize that you could not do that. And in a slightly more serious way, like I just found that like the Borg / Kubernetes abstraction was really powerful and really helped the SRE teams. And then there were other people that wanted it for different reasons. So a lot of our customers are customers who run it themselves, who aren't on CockroachCloud. A lot of them use Kubernetes to run CockroachDB.
True.
So it's just good. There's a desire for CockroachCloud and these customers to use the same technologies to operate the database, because then we can kind of like learn from each other. Yeah.
You mentioned that we don't use Kubernetes in the way it's intended to be. We use it for something else. Can you elaborate on that point?
I don't think, yeah. So there's kind of like two main pieces of skepticism that people had, and they're kind of connected. So yeah, one of the pieces of skepticism is like what you're saying, Amruta, where Kubernetes is built for kind of a specific use case, most of all. And it's this use case where you have lots of services. Maybe they all look different. They all require different amounts of CPU and everything. And then you deploy them on a Kubernetes cluster. And Kubernetes is going to bin pack lots of different workloads onto the same VM. And that just doesn't really describe us.
Right.
And then the other thing that kind of follows from that is also that the Kubernetes networking stack is very, very complicated. And those were the two things that people were saying, like, maybe we don't need this. Like, we don't really fit that model. And also the networking stack is scary.
Then why did we choose it?
So, well, okay, first I just want to say, like, I just kind of want to give a little more color to the thing about the use case.
Sure, yeah.
So, the thing about CockroachCloud is it's not like a bunch of different services that all look different and are developed by different developer teams. Instead, like, we're just trying to run CockroachDB for our customers, and CockroachDB like always looks basically the same. And also, it's like this complicated SQL database and needs a fair amount of like CPU and resources in order to run well. Generally, we want to run CockroachDB on a single VM and have the whole VM, all the vCPUs on the VM dedicated to running CockroachDB.
Yes.
So like this is the sense in which we don't need this benefit of running multiple workloads or pods on the same VM. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you were kind of saying then, like, why did we do it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that's how I understand Kubernetes is the use case that you just described,
Right.
but I know that that's not how we use it.
Right. So despite that we don't really need the benefit of running multiple workloads on a single VM. What we do really like about Kubernetes is that it provides this really like powerful automation foundation and like these automation primitives that kind of mean that the SRE team and the developer teams don't need to worry about super low level details that honestly are at some level are not very interesting. So like with Kubernetes, the SRE team can kind of speak Kubernetes to Kubernetes, and then Kubernetes will manage loading Docker images onto VMs and keeping it running and doing health checks, and in certain cases doing load balancing. And the SRE team, I mean, they still have to worry about those things, but they worry about them at like a higher level of abstraction than they would without those tools. You know, there's other tools that can get you that abstraction also, but Kubernetes is a solid one.
The other scary part of the Kubernetes story is the networking stack. Can you talk more about how we solved that, the networking issue?
Yeah. So the networking stack, there's like kind of two pieces, but before we talk about like how we fixed it, there's kind of two pieces of complexity. So one piece of the complexity is kind of the single region case. So when you have a single region Kubernetes cluster, which is the common case. And that complexity, it all kind of comes from the fact that you run multiple pods on a single VM, or at least a lot of it comes from that fact. And basically what that means is a single VM is going to have multiple IP addresses that are routing to it because multiple pods are there and each pod has its own IP address.
Right.
And so that introduces a certain amount of complexity. There's different like network models that people have come up with to handle it, but it's something like new to get your head around, I guess. But then the thing that's more CockroachDB specific is the multi-region networking thing.
So when I think of CockroachDB, I think of like easily scalable and like multi-region. Is Kubernetes as easy, like as it sounds, or?
Yeah, so not really.
Okay.
So CockroachDB is designed to be this database that you can run across multiple cloud regions.
Mm-hmm.
And you might do that because you want better latencies in certain regions.
Mm-hmm.
You might do that because you want to be able to survive outages that are, regional, but the whole region's down.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of different reasons. But we've designed it that way. That's one of like the main goals.
Mm-hmm.
Kubernetes is not like that at all. Kubernetes is not designed to be run across multiple regions. It won't really work. And to add a little more color to that, like the cloud providers, they provide these managed Kubernetes offerings, GKE and EKS. But those are all regional. So you have to choose a region to run in.
Right.
So what this means is that in the CockroachCloud case, what we have to do is run a single CockroachDB cluster across multiple Kubernetes clusters.
Okay.
One per region that we want to run the Cockroach cluster in.
Right.
We have to do this in a way where, despite that there are multiple Kubernetes clusters, the CockroachDB nodes can still all talk to each other.
Right.
So there's different ways of doing this. There's like, I think there's a blog post about different ways that we posted, and it mentions 4 ways. And we also have a webinar coming that's about that content also. But the way we're going with on CockroachCloud we call it DNS chaining.
Okay.
The idea is that each Kubernetes cluster has a DNS service like running inside of it. And we make it so that from region A, if you want to look up a DNS name that's actually where the thing that you're looking up is actually in region B.
Okay.
We changed the Kubernetes DNS services so that they can do those lookups.
Okay.
We basically expose a load balancer, which gives access to the Kubernetes DNS service. And then we teach Kubernetes how to like route to that load balancer.
I remember a conversation about this being different on AWS and GCP.
Yeah, it's mostly the same at like a high level. There are some differences. One difference is that on GCP, when you create a new project, you get a network that's global, where you can like route from any region to any other region without any problems.
Right.
On EKS, you don't, or just on AWS, you don't get that network. So you have to do work in order to get it. You have to VPC peer regions together.
Okay.
So that's one source of difference. But yeah, there are some differences.
Right. Apart from this, were there any other differences you came across in the implementations on AWS and GCP, or was it like smooth sailing apart from this one?
There were other differences. EKS is further behind than GKE in terms of what version of Kubernetes it's running. It seems like Google is perhaps investing more heavily in it, having also been the creator of it.
Right.
So like one specific difference, there's this field called the load balancer source range field. And we use this to implement firewalling so that the CockroachCloud database can only be accessed from certain IPs, from IPs that our users like want it to be accessed from. And this field on AWS just like doesn't work. But it doesn't fail in like a nice, like, I don't work, I'm not implemented way. Instead, it fails in like a subtle, the result is wrong, but it suggests that it's fine. So
okay, that's
that was
tricky.
fun.
Okay. I want to backtrack a little. At the beginning, you mentioned that there were 2 camps in our team. One was for Kubernetes.
Right.
What was the other camp for? Like, what other technologies were you evaluating to automate CockroachCloud?
Well, when we were in our alpha, we were using a different set of technologies. So that's kind of what we were deciding if we would move to Kubernetes from the previous set. The way it worked in our alpha was we would use Terraform to spin up VMs and other infrastructure like load balancers, just like plain VMs. And then we would load the binary and set up supervisor scripts and other stuff like that. And we do all that with some Go code, which was kind of scripty, and which you would run manually.
Right.
And so this model, this worked fine in that it was pretty quick to set up, and it's how we started. But when we got into this like self-service world where we wanted to create clusters from a UI in 15 or so minutes, we felt that like that set of automation technologies just wasn't going to be robust enough. Like having the low-level Kubernetes foundation was just going to make it much easier to build this like self-service, reliable like automation platform for our users.
Interesting. Okay. So from this conversation, I understand that we made it super easy for the customers. We're also getting customer feedback, which says that creating clusters is super easy on CockroachCloud. So we kind of took the complexity away from them and took it to the backend. How difficult was it for you to implement it on the backend, though?
It was definitely pretty difficult. I mean, it was, I guess, so we've been working on this for like 9 months. And now we're in our beta, so we're kind of launching. And I think we're really, really excited about that. And it was like fun, difficult, not like head against the wall difficult. But there was just like a lot to learn. Like we learned a lot of stuff about Kubernetes that we didn't know when we started working on this project.
Okay, so you have been working on this for 9 months. We went through the whole thing of like, do we want to even go with Kubernetes? And then we researched all of it and made it work. And now we have made that decision and like committed to it. So what's on your mind now? What are you looking out for?
The SRE team is starting a 24/7 on-call rotation, and that's new. The 24/7. We had a support rotation that was 24/7, but we didn't have an SRE 24/7 rotation. And so the SREs, we did a lot of the Kubernetes work. So we learned a lot about how to kind of do Kubernetes development, how to build this control plane on top of Kubernetes. And I think that was fun, and we learned a lot. But we're excited to kind of like use that knowledge to be good on-call engineers for CockroachCloud, and thus to a certain extent Kubernetes. I think we're excited to kind of like have our lives transformed in that way. I mean, it will be, there'll be days where waking up in the middle of the night and you're like, why did I say I was excited? I'm not excited at all, but for the most part, excited.
So you have built this experience, and our team has built this experience of running multi-region CockroachDB on Kubernetes for CockroachCloud. And as I mentioned before, a lot of our customers also do that. They want to run CockroachDB on Kubernetes. So do you have like recommendations for them on if they want to do it themselves?
Yeah. Okay, the first thing I would say is that if you want to do it yourself, consider if you really need to do it yourself. And if you don't, then use CockroachCloud.
True.
I'm kind of joking, but also like distributed SQL database operating on top of another distributed system called Kubernetes.
Yeah.
Very doable, but CockroachCloud much easier.
All right.
Then I guess if you did have reasons to do that, then there are very good reasons. The one thing would be to try to use Google or Amazon's managed Kubernetes offerings rather than also running Kubernetes yourself.
Yeah.
Because Kubernetes is also a big, complicated distributed system.
Yeah.
And if you cannot run that, that's great too. We run CockroachCloud on top of GK and EKS, for example.
Right.
And then also another thing is we have more kind of stuff coming out about how to do multi-region Kubernetes, which is like a very important thing when you're talking about CockroachDB.
Yeah.
We have a webinar, we have some docs, we have some blog posts. So definitely like check that out. Hopefully that'll help.
Okay. That were all the questions I had. We have some from the chat.
Yeah. All right. Let's see.
Let's do it. Want me to read them out?
Let's see this one.
Has it been your experience that Kubernetes works better with stateless services? I've been hearing a lot about stateless services lately.
I would say that I think I'd say that that's been our experience. So we run the control plane software, the thing that is like the equivalent of the GCP console. That's a stateless service, and we run that on Kubernetes. And it's definitely, the setup of it is a lot less complicated than the setup of the database on top of Kubernetes. like I think the tools that Kubernetes has now are good enough that running stateful services on top of it is also very doable. But it is easier to not to worry about that. There's certain classes of bugs that just won't come up. And that's definitely nice.
Any other
Let me see the questions.
Other questions? What is that?
Console.
Oh,
Do you want me to read it?
yeah.
So we have a question here. Do you use Console Connect for service discovery? And I don't know what the other word is, but what? FW, I'm not sure what that stands for.
Yeah.
We don't use Console right now.
What is console?
It's a service discovery tool.
Okay.
I don't really know a ton about it. We've kind of like talked about using kind of network abstractions that are on top of Kubernetes, and we've kind of discussed whether that is useful for us. I think it's probably more useful when you're in that like lots of different microservice world than when you're in this, we're just using Kubernetes as like this low level automation framework world that CockroachCloud is in. But it's definitely something that we keep kind of like checking out and learning more about.
Oh, I like this one. What's the strangest Kubernetes bug you have run into?
The strangest Kubernetes bug that we've run into. Okay. Definitely. There's a very clear answer to this one. It's just a little bit hard to explain, but I think I can do it. So let me think. Okay, so we've run into this bug before where CockroachDB is a stateful service. So we need to provision like persistent disks where we put the data, and then we also need a node that is running CockroachDB and is attached to that persistent disk. And the way this works in Kubernetes is a thing called persistent volumes claims and persistent volumes. There's some really strange edges in the way that works though. We've hit two edges. One edge, basically if you don't set a certain fields, then it can be the case that Kubernetes will spin up your VM your VM and your persistent disk will be in different zones, and then they can't connect to each other because you can't do that. And Kubernetes will never fix the problem on its own. It will just leave it. That was a bit strange.
I remember this bug.
Yeah, and we hit it two times. We hit it one time, and then you set this field called wait for first consumer. And then it fixes it because what Kubernetes will do is it waits until a node has been selected to run the pod before it provisions the persistent disk, which is the behavior you want, arguably by default, but whatever. And then we hit it another time because we had this race where we edited we changed the managed instance groups, and Kubernetes takes time to have that update be reflected in its view of the node, like its view of what nodes there are. And during that race, it would choose a node that no longer existed. So those have both been pretty funny.
Yeah, they are weird. Yeah.
Do you recommend this one?
Okay. Do you recommend running Kubernetes on-prem?
Well, I definitely don't have experience with that. I've been at Google, and here we use public clouds, and at Google we had I guess it was technically on-prem, but Google's on-prem is pretty solid. I would say in general that running Kubernetes yourself, which you'd have to do, I presume, if you run on-premise, is definitely a complicated thing. There's the network model that you have to create in order for Kubernetes to run well is complicated, and I don't know a lot about how much complexity you take on when you do that on-premise. But I mean, I also know that a lot of customers do this, so I'm sure it's doable. And if you have to do it, I'm sure you can succeed with it.
I almost want to say good luck if you try to do it. So it's, yeah. What one do you want to do next?
I don't really understand what this means. This question about auto scaling. This is something that we would want to play with some of these ideas, because right now, the way our database works is you tell us that you want a certain amount of nodes, and each node has a certain amount of CPU and storage associated with it. And regardless of whether you're using all that CPU or none of that CPU, that's how much like storage and CPU you're going to pay for. And we're interested in making it, building kind of like auto scaling features or other things that make it so that you only pay for what you use. But we haven't really played with that yet. But it seems a cool thing to me.
Would that mean like editing the cluster, or would it mean like you're running out of space and Kubernetes just provisions more for you, or both?
Yeah, there are features in the public, at least in GK and EKS, where they will like increase the number of Kubernetes nodes available to you if needed, according to the fact that your pods can't schedule because there's no place for them to run.
Okay.
And those seem like cool technologies. We just haven't played with them yet.
Okay.
What about the Borg?
Oh yeah.
There was another question about kind of like Borg, which is the Google Kubernetes-like thing.
Yeah.
And versus Kubernetes.
Like the difference between Borg and Kubernetes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I think that one difference is that Kubernetes came out of Borg. Borg is a predecessor to Kubernetes. So Kubernetes has, in my opinion, a much more coherent design in the sense that like you can kind of get your head around how it works. It's complicated, but it has a kind of design to it. Like at a high level, the way it works is there's this like hierarchy of controllers, and they're very declarative. So they read some state. They read what the user has told them should be the state of the world, and then they go and they write the lower level details that they need to in order to make that state of the world like happen. And there's a hierarchy of them. So like at the highest level, you have the stateful set, and then at a lower level, you have a specific like pod running. And that's like pretty coherent and pretty clear, versus Borg is a little bit more of a black box. Like there's this SRE team and development teams at Google, really big teams, and they make the black box extremely solid. Like you never really have to worry about how it works. It works very well. But its design is a little bit more opaque, I think. There's also differences in the network setups, but similarly for Kubernetes, you have to worry about it a little bit, versus when you're at Google and you're working with Borg, you don't really have to, because there's so many teams of people that are like providing that network abstraction to you.
I like this question.
Yeah.
The question is, can you talk about how you whitelist IPs? How do you whitelist IP addresses of CockroachDB across regions?
Yeah, it's a good question. We've actually done this multiple ways and kind of gone back and forth about what the right way to do it is. So there is this field. So right now what we're doing in CockroachCloud for GKE only is we're using a service of type load balancer. And then what a service type load balancer does is it spins up a network load balancer on GCP that points to your Kubernetes service. And it does it all for you. So it's all from within Kubernetes. And then we use this field called load balancer source ranges, which allows you to whitelist certain IPs via like standard GCP firewall rules. As your question is kind of pointing out, because you're configuring the load balancer and the firewall through Kubernetes, it's a regional firewall because Kubernetes is regional. So we just have the same the way we handle this is that just in every Kubernetes region, we write the same stuff. So there is a firewall per region, but it has all the same content. And so it provides the abstraction we want, which is firewalling. On AWS, we do it a different way. We actually like manually spin up a security group instead of using this field. We can't use the field because the field doesn't work. There's also this thing called networking configs, which would be a possible implementation, which we haven't looked into as much. There's a lot of options, and they all kind of have, none of them are perfect, but yeah.
Okay. Do you have more questions?
There are 2 in the chat.
2 in the chat. Okay, let's do so there's one question about how many people does it take to make Cockroach on Kubernetes happen in 10 months? Well, right now there's like maybe 18 people on the broader CockroachCloud team. There's like 6 SREs or so, and then 14 or so front-end / back-end developers. The SREs were pretty focused on the CockroachDB on Kubernetes part. That was like their main contribution. So I think there were probably, when I started, there were like more like 3 SREs working on it, and it probably stayed that way for 4 or 5 months. And then we got 2 more, and then we got 6, and we've been there since. So somewhere between like 3 and 5 SREs over 10 months or so.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, I just want to make sure it's clear that like it's much, 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 much easier to just run CockroachDB on top of Kubernetes. That's something that you do not need 8 people developing for 10 months. That's something that's well documented and is clear. I mean, there's some edges, but it's very doable. The 8 months is for building a whole managed service on top of Kubernetes. That is a taller task and one that most companies are going to do.
Also the multi-region part.
Yeah, but even the multi-region part, if you're a potential user of CockroachDB and you're considering running CockroachDB multi-region on Kubernetes, that's not 10 months of work, not even close. It's well documented. There's some edges, but it's totally doable. It's building a managed service that takes so long.
Yeah, that's good.
Desired performance. Yeah. There's another question about kind of like desired performance. Like, how do you get the good performance out of CockroachDB on Kubernetes? We do have some docs about this with some like more specific things. For the most part, I think like one thing that's important is you have to make sure that the CockroachDB processes are getting the resources they need, because they really do require like a fair amount of resources in order to work well. There are Kubernetes tools that let you do this, let you like provision a certain amount of CPU specifically for the CockroachDB pods. And you want to use those and make sure that you're getting the right amount of resources for them. But I don't think there's a lot of like, I think for the most part, running it on top of Kubernetes doesn't make it that much harder to get good performance. Like at the end of the day, it's still the same software running, it's just a different way of running it.
Yeah, and the question about are there standard recommendations? We do have documents about running CockroachDB on Kubernetes, which does, I think, talk about allocating resources to help with the performance. So I think Jessica will send out an email with all the links to those documents later. So that should be helpful. And if not, always contact us and we'll help you out. There are questions in the Q&A panel.
I'm gonna answer this one. So there's a question about binpacking not being super important. And then are we running one-to-one VM to CockroachDB node? Mostly. I'm exaggerating. So I'm exaggerating a little bit. We don't want to run 2 CockroachDB processes on a single VM, because we want the whole VM for performance reasons, and also we want to be able to survive VM outages. And CockroachDB can do this so long as you don't put multiple processes in the same VM. But we are running some extra software on some of the VMs that are running the CockroachDB node. So for example, we have a piece of software that's taking backups. We have a piece of software which we call the prober, which is sending SQL queries in order to test the database is working. And those things, they don't really require, they don't require almost any CPU or storage. They're very small, so we just put them on the same VM as a CockroachDB process. And that works like very well and is another like nice side benefit of using Kubernetes. But it's not, for a lot of users of Kubernetes, it's like that's a big part of why it's a powerful model, and for us it's not like that. So there's a question about peering, VPC peering. So right now we can't do this, but this is on our roadmap. It's very high on our roadmap. So yeah, we want to make it the case that eventually you can create a CockroachCloud cluster and then you can VPC peer our cluster, your CockroachCloud cluster into some other GCP project or AWS account in which you're running your application servers. And then you get really good security. And that's really great. And it's also really simple. And so that's definitely something that's coming, but we don't have it yet. All right, there's one more question. The question is about running, even though CockroachDB is a distributed database, do you ever run a single node on Kubernetes? And the question is also about how you handle when Kubernetes wants to move that single node pod to another cluster instance. This is a good question. So when CockroachDB was designed, the idea was really to run at minimum 3 nodes. Since then, we've started to think that running a single node of CockroachDB with the right production setup could still be a good setup. I mean, I say that with a lot of caveats, and we're still kind of figuring out how we can make that a good production setup. And we're not quite there yet, but it's kind of something we're trying to figure out. So you're saying like one thing about durability and mount volumes. Like if we do this, one benefit of the way CockroachCloud is running is that we use cloud persistent disk in order to provide storage, and those are replicated under the hood. So if you lose the VM, you don't actually lose all your storage. So there's things like that we're kind of still trying to figure out, like how the fact that you have this like distributed persistent disk abstraction, how that can like help us build reliable single node CockroachDB. And we don't have answers yet, but that's something that we're kind of exploring more.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, okay, so there's a question about why use Kubernetes? I get it for a small app, but why abstract your storage and compute layer in this way? And this person also points out that there's other tools, such as like Ansible, that let you, you know, that give you kind of similar things to Kubernetes. Well, I mean, I think that there's a few different reasons. I think one thing to say is that like there's a lot of different ways that you could build something like CockroachCloud. Like we built it this way. There's other ways you could build it, and you could build it reliably with different underlying technologies. Like no technology is perfect. Kubernetes has pros and cons. So like what you're saying about Ansible, I guess to some extent, though I'm not familiar with that tool in a deep sense, like to some extent I think you could. We thought though that there were some things about Kubernetes that are kind of compelling. So like one is that a lot of our customers, like I was saying, are already running on Kubernetes, and we think that the experience that we get from operating CockroachCloud on Kubernetes will help those customers, and that's important to us. It's like I think it's 50% or something. It's something very high. Another is that we desire the ability to run across a lot of different clouds. Right now, just GCP and AWS, but later Azure and other clouds. And we think that what's going to happen is it's going to be pretty easy to run Kubernetes clusters on top of all those clouds. And if we build CockroachCloud on top of Kubernetes, then it will be pretty easy to move CockroachCloud to those other clouds. And that's another like benefit. But you know, there are different ways you could build it. But this is, you know, we've had success building it this way.
Yeah. One of the benefits of running CockroachCloud on Kubernetes has been our internal learning, like dogfooding it.
Right.
And we have been documenting the process as we go along so that we can convert it into knowledge for our non-CockroachCloud customers and make their implementations easier.
Another thing is that like there's a fair amount of complexity to running a distributed database on top of Kubernetes, but when your whole team's focus is doing that, like the SRE team at CockroachDB, their job is to like run CockroachDB reliably on top of something. And it's just like, it's a complexity that I think the group of people can totally take on. And you learn it really well, then it becomes less complex. And that's definitely already happened. Anything else, Jessica? Should we wrap it up?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I think we're all good.
Yeah, I think that's all the questions we had. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Jessica, if you want to take over.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this technical chat today. You're going to get a survey over email, and you'll get the recording mailed to you, emailed to you, not in the mail. You'll get a survey, and we'll have more of those Kubernetes resources for you in case there are questions that we didn't get to. Also, the next couple of weeks are going to be running KubeCon University, is what we're calling it. So you'll receive some resources about that. We'll direct you to upcoming webinars, also covering Kubernetes. These are all in the lead up to KubeCon North America. And if you're headed to KubeCon North America, meet us there. We'll have a booth. We're having a party. That's it. Thank you so much.